In a quiet corner of Bryan County, Georgia, the day began like any other. Hundreds of men and women filed into the massive Hyundai LG Energy Solution construction site. For them, this was more than a job. It was a chance to help build the future of electric vehicles. And for many of the South Korean nationals on site, it was an opportunity that promised stability and income for families back home. But on this day, their lives would be torn apart. At dawn, the sound of helicopters filled the sky. Black SUVs and armored vehicles rolled onto the site. Before anyone could understand what was happening, federal agents swarmed the area. They moved in with military precision, surrounding the unfinished factory like it was a war zone. Shouts echoed across the steel beams and scaffolding as men in tactical gear ordered workers to stop, line up, and prepare for inspection. By mid-morning, chaos had turned into shock. Hundreds of workers were handcuffed and escorted onto buses. Some were accused of lacking the proper visas. Others were suspected of document fraud. By the time the raid ended, nearly 500 people were detained, 475 in total. And among them were hundreds of South Korean nationals, caught in a web of U.S. immigration enforcement. For the workers, it was a nightmare. They had come to America with dreams of building cars for the future, of sending money back to their families, of chasing opportunity. Instead, they were marched away like criminals, stripped of their phones, and thrown into detention centers. Their families back home suddenly found themselves in darkness, unable to call, unable to know whether their loved ones were safe. The scale of the operation stunned the world. This was not just another workplace sweep. Officials confirmed it was the largest single-site immigration raid ever carried out in U.S. history. The message from Washington was clear. No matter how big the project, no matter how critical the foreign partnership, America was cracking down. But the timing could not have been worse. Only weeks earlier, South Korea had signed a landmark agreement with the United States. Seoul had pledged more than $300 billion in investments and energy purchases, while Washington promised tariff reductions and deeper industrial cooperation. The ink on that deal was barely dry. And now, America had detained hundreds of Korean workers in a public spectacle that humiliated Seoul. News traveled quickly across the Pacific. In South Korea, television screens filled with breaking reports. Anchors spoke of shock and outrage. Families rushed to government offices, demanding answers. President Lee Jae-myung summoned his cabinet for an emergency meeting. His message was simple and firm. Bring our people home. Foreign Minister Cho Hyun addressed the nation, calling the arrests a grave matter, and warning that Seoul would not stand by while its citizens were treated like criminals abroad. The words struck a nerve across South Korea. For many, this wasn't just about the detainees, it was about pride, dignity, and the alliance itself. Behind the numbers, there were human stories. Some workers had been in Georgia for months, diligently following instructions from subcontractors. They believed their visas were in order, only to discover that mistakes had been made. Others had knowingly overstayed, desperate to keep earning wages for families back home. And still others were young men and women who had never set foot in America before, suddenly swept into a legal battle they couldn't understand. One worker would later tell reporters, "I wasn't a criminal. I was building cars for the future. Why did they treat me like a terrorist?" Those words spread through social media in Korea, fueling public anger and demanding government action. Meanwhile, in Washington, the official line was unwavering. Homeland Security insisted the raid was not political, not targeted at any one nationality, but simply part of enforcing U.S. law. Yet privately, officials worried. They knew that detaining hundreds of South Korean nationals workers tied to one of America's largest industrial projects was no ordinary matter. This could spiral into a diplomatic crisis. Negotiations began almost immediately. Seoul sent urgent communications to U.S. agencies, demanding information, demanding access, demanding release. But talks were tense. Washington emphasized legality. Seoul emphasized humanity. For 3 long days, the detainees sat in limbo, while 2 governments argued behind closed doors. And back in South Korea, the families waited. At airports, mothers and fathers clutched photographs of sons and daughters. Children held signs, hoping their parents would walk through arrival gates. But no one came. The silence was unbearable. This was more than a legal dispute. It was about national honor. South Korea is home to 30,000 U.S. troops, stationed on the peninsula as a shield against the North. The alliance has been the backbone of security in Northeast Asia for decades. And yet, here it was strained, shaken, tested by a raid in rural Georgia. As each day passed, pressure mounted. Seoul could not simply sit idle. Washington could not appear weak. And the workers, the men and women whose only crime was chasing opportunity, remained caught in between. Would diplomacy succeed? Would they see home again? The answer was coming, but it would not come without cost. 3 days after the raid, the silence finally broke. Seoul announced that a deal had been reached with Washington. The agreement was straightforward but delicate. More than 300 of the detained South Korean nationals would be released and flown home on a chartered flight. The remainder, mostly subcontracted workers with incomplete documentation, would remain in custody pending further review. For Seoul, it was a partial victory, a sign that its pressure had worked. For Washington, it was a compromise enough to ease tensions without appearing to back down. When the news reached families in Korea, relief swept across the nation. At Incheon Airport, crowds gathered, waiting for the first arrivals. Hours later, the plane landed. The passengers stepped off slowly, carrying plastic bags of personal items, faces marked by exhaustion. Some wept as they embraced family members. Others simply stood still, stunned that the nightmare was finally over. For them, the ordeal had lasted only days, but the scars would remain. In Seoul, the government celebrated. President Lee declared the rescue a testament to his administration's resolve. Foreign Minister Cho vowed to prevent such an incident from ever happening again. Plans were announced to reform visa systems, strengthen protections for overseas workers, and close the legal gray zones that had allowed the crisis to erupt. But in Washington, the tone was different. Officials defended the raid as lawful, necessary, and proof of America's commitment to enforcing its immigration policies. "No one is above the law," a spokesman said. Not even foreign nationals working on billion-dollar projects. The split in narratives revealed the deeper tension. For South Korea, the raid was a humiliation. For Washington, it was a political weapon. Immigration had become a flashpoint in American politics, and officials wanted to show strength. But in doing so, they risked alienating one of their closest allies. Beyond the politics, the economic implications were enormous. The Hyundai LG battery plant represented billions of dollars in investment and thousands of future jobs. Disrupting it not only threatened industrial timelines, but also raised questions about whether America could balance domestic enforcement with global cooperation. Investors watched nervously, wondering if other projects might face similar turbulence. For Seoul, there was another concern: security. With North Korea watching, and China eager to exploit any cracks in the US-Korea alliance, the timing of the crisis could not have been worse. Allies must appear united, especially in moments of global uncertainty. Instead, the raid exposed vulnerabilities. Yet amidst the politics and geopolitics, the human stories remain the most powerful. Families reunited, tears shed, promises whispered never to return to America. One worker told reporters that although he was grateful to be free, the experience had changed him forever. He would never again trust a system that treated him like a criminal for trying to work. The Hyundai raid will be remembered not only for its size, but also for its symbolism. It showed how quickly alliances can be strained by domestic politics. It showed how fragile globalization truly is, when a single raid can disrupt billion-dollar projects in international relations. And it showed, most importantly, that behind every headline are people, ordinary men and women whose lives can be upended in an instant. For Washington, the message was one of law and order. For Seoul, it was one of resilience and rescue. For the workers, it was survival. And for the world, it was a reminder. Alliances are strong, but they are not unbreakable. Diplomacy worked this time. The detainees came home, but the scars remain. And the next time law collides with loyalty, the outcome may not be so simple, because in the end, this was never just about visas or factories. It was about pride, politics, and the fragile bonds that hold nations together. And that is the story of the raid that shook Seoul and the diplomatic rescue that followed.